Welcome back to the Unapologetic podcast. I have a guest with me today. I have Kerry Barrett, who is the founder of Kerry Barrett Incorporated, and she is an expert at getting on camera. She's a PR coach, and we are going to talk about all things getting visible on camera and PR and I don't know, whatever else we get into. But
Yep.
Kerry, introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for having me, Tara. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, you covered the basics. I teach people how to generate their own PR for their small business, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And as you mentioned, I'm an on-camera expert. My background is that I have 20 years as a TV broadcast news anchor. I finished my career at WNBC in New York City. I'm based in the US. And I left the news industry about 5-ish years ago now and use what I learned in that industry to help my clients, both with, again, on-camera speaking, video, for lack of a better word. Video is everywhere right now. And then I take my experience as a media person and I help clients understand the media, how to pitch the media for stories, etc. So I draw really heavily for both of those on my professional background.
Yes. And I want you to talk about like how you got into all of this because we've chatted about it and I find it so interesting because it's not like everyone just decides that they're be a news anchor or like
Yeah.
be on the news. So how
Yeah.
did this all come about?
Oh, this is it's sort of a long and winding story, but I'll do my best to abridge it. I actually started in college as a pre-veterinary medicine major. And I'd always wanted to be a vet, love animals, and was actually really shy and sort of introverted. And I still am to this day. But one of the other reasons that I really wanted to be a vet is because I sort of hoped I wouldn't have to talk to people as much because it was very intimidating for me. Well, apparently the only other thing that I got along with worse than speaking to people was organic chemistry. So that shut my dreams of becoming a veterinarian down fairly quickly. And I took a year and a half off from college to, quote unquote, find myself.
Yep.
And a year and a half went by. I still hadn't found myself. And so I re-enrolled. I was watching everybody graduate and I'm like, well, I gotta do something. So I re-enrolled in a communications program. It was very broad. It's speech pathology and business communications, and there was journalism and a little bit of, PR and marketing and that sort of stuff. And I figured I'd be able to use something that I would get from that degree to make a living. Bonus,
Mhm.
I know organic chemistry, and also I would have to take 2 public speaking courses, which somehow instinctually knew, as much as I was dreading it, that it was something I sort of needed to get my arms around. And so when I re-enrolled, I was trying to fill my schedule with tons of credits so that I could make up a little bit anyway for lost time. I think 12
Mhm.
was time and I was taking 24. And I wanted to figure out how I could jam another 3 credits in there. And so I was in class from basically 9 to 6 every morning, or excuse me, 8 to 6 every day is what I meant to say. And so I had to find an internship that operated sort of outside of regular business hours.
Yeah.
Well, the news, it's, 24/7, 365. So the local NBC affiliate where I went to school, Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, I got an internship there. And from the very first day that I went out with a reporter, and I worked on the evening shows, I interned for the evening shows because that's what worked for me. I absolutely loved it. So then I had to figure out how I was going to not just overcome this fear that I still had, despite the public speaking courses, but that I was also going to be able to get good enough at this
Hmm.
that somebody would pay me to do it in a highly competitive industry. So
Yeah.
that really began the journey. I've always loved storytelling. I grew up overseas as a child, and um, always like sort of looking behind the curtain and learning more about people and their stories despite my shyness. So while I wouldn't have necessarily tied those, that background and journalism together in the very beginning, I recognized that there were some through lines from one to the other. And I recognized that as I, proceeded in that line of work.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that I just find it so interesting because I imagine it would be competitive. I don't know. I personally, I don't know anyone that like wants to do that, but I don't know anyone that does what I do either. So I feel like it's like,
We're in good company with each other.
yeah, who knows? But I feel like it's not an easy thing to get into.
No.
It's not like anybody can just go and be like, hey, I want to be on the news today. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. No, and the other thing that people may not think about is that aside from, I mean, when I started, it's changed a lot. I mean, I was in the
mhm,
industry for 20 years. So when I started, it was back in like the early 2000s, and it was a much different industry than it is now. The smartphones weren't a thing. We didn't have Twitter. There wasn't a news feed on our phones, et cetera, et cetera. So when I first started, it's an industry that's in contraction now. But when I first started, it was not.
yeah,
And every opening had, at least 500 applicants, maybe more. And when you think about, these are not positions that are available in every town in the country the way
yeah,
maybe, I don't know, a sales position or a teaching position is. There's markets, and there's a finite number of them. So there's only certain towns that you can look in. And then if you think about it, there's four major affiliates, right? NBC, ABC, Fox, and CBS. So you have maybe a handful of, and not every market even has all of them. So you have
mhm,
like maybe three or so places that you can look for in each town that might have a job for you. And then there is, I mean, maybe there's no positions open, or maybe
yeah,
there's one position open. And so it's incredibly challenging. It was when I must have sent out 500, we sent out resume tapes. They want to see what you look like on camera.
yeah,
So instead of an actual resume, which you do as well, I was sending out VHS tapes with 8
yeah,
minutes, me talking on camera and, doing, packaged pieces, and to demonstrate my storytelling and my ability to command a camera, which by the way was absolutely horrible in the beginning. It was
yeah,
really bad, terrible, and terrified. In fact, I had a couple of news directors who make the hiring decisions in the smaller markets, definitely, and had called me and said things like, your voice is really terrible, or
thank you.
yeah, thank you so much for that. Or, I was timid. That's what it was. I
Yeah,
mean, my voice I eventually grew my confidence, and my voice turned into what my voice is now, which is how I speak, in everyday sort of communication. But back
yeah,
then, I was timid, and my voice got small and monotone, and it sounded
yeah,
very green, if you will. So
yeah.
yeah, I was pretty bad when I first started. I got real lucky that somebody took a chance on me.
So where was your first job out of? Who took
Yeah,
the bets on you first?
Wichita Falls, Texas, which, if you're not familiar with Texas, is north central Texas. It's about 2 hours north of Dallas and about 2 hours south of Oklahoma City. We were right on the border of the two. And the way that I got that position, the reporter that I worked very closely with during my internship when I was in college, I had a
Hmm.
few, but that one that I mentioned, actually got her first job at this station as well. And so the news director saw on my resume that I had interned at the same station that she then worked on. So called her and said, we have an applicant for this role. I see that she interned at your station. Tell me a little bit about, what you know about her. And at that point, it was like, I don't know. I went to grad school, so we're talking probably 4 years ish later. I finished undergrad, had a 6 month break, and then 2 years of grad school. So it was a while,
Yeah.
and I'm lucky she remembered me because I hadn't kept in touch with her. Which mistake number one, I was not good at networking, but she gave me the seal of approval, and that's how that position transpired. And then from there, it was on to Phoenix, Arizona. And then from Arizona, it was to Salt Lake City, Utah, and then to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then I wrapped up my career, as I mentioned, in New York City.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's so interesting, like all over the place. So
Yeah.
when you very first started, just because I'm interested in this, and then we'll go into everything that you do now, but when you first started, what kind of stories did they have you covering?
I mean, we're in a small town, so
Yeah.
there's not a lot of breaking news, if you will. There weren't those sorts of situations that you see in the larger markets. There was not, you know, standard news fairs, not shootings and drive-bys and all that other stuff. So we enterprise stories, meaning we had to go out and we developed sources, and we got very creative with the stories that we found. So really, we were in charge of our own story development. I was on an education beat, which means I focused on education stories. Definitely not the only thing I covered. I wouldn't even say it was the majority of what I covered, but it was all sorts of stories, blood
Mhm.
drives, and there was a kidnapping one time, and there was, some approaching gang violence. I mean, it's sort of your standard news stuff, but I
Yeah.
got a really good background in telling both or human interest stories, creative enterprise stories, and then also what we would call hard news, which is the, city council meetings and the any crime that there was, that sort of stuff.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. So what was your favorite to cover?
My favorite story that I ever covered was actually when I was in Salt Lake City. I've always had an anchoring sort of track, if you will. So when I first started in Wichita Falls, I was a weekday reporter and a weekend anchor. And then in Phoenix, I hosted a sort of a news magazine lifestyle show. And then in Salt Lake City, I anchored the morning show. Anyway, my favorite story was when I was in Salt Lake City and I went overseas. I was in Iraq for about three
Wow.
weeks
Yeah.
and I reported from Balad Air Base, which, if you're not familiar, and I don't know why you would be, it's a joint Air Force and Army base in Iraq, actually built on one of Saddam Hussein's old Olympic training grounds. It was really interesting.
That's
So I was over there for 3 weeks. My husband was Air Force at the time, and his squadron happened to be over there at the same time that I was doing the story. And so it was really interesting to talk to them. We did a lot of pieces where we followed, the families back at home, and really took a comprehensive look at everything that it involved for the families. It was not a political story. It was not really about the war itself. It was about,
Mhm.
again, sort of what I liked about traveling when I was a kid, looking behind the scenes, sort of
Yeah.
peeking behind the curtain and understanding what it meant to the people that were there and the people who were still at home.
Hmm. That's insane.
Yeah.
That's like, that's so interesting. And I've always, because I mean, all of us have seen stories like that of people that go overseas and report on these things.
Yeah.
And I always find it so fascinating. I don't know if I could do it. That's what I
Yeah.
always think. Did you feel safe when you were there?
I mean, I did, we were in, not always. I mean, if we were up in the air, we did a bunch of runs with like cargo jets who were going to Kuwait, et cetera, to drop off supplies to troops there. The interesting thing is when they're flying those big, heavy planes in what is essentially a war zone, they have to do something called defensive flying, which means they don't take off and land the way that you expect a plane of that size. It's not a passenger plane. So
Yeah.
they're doing all these defensive moves as they take off and as they land, because at that time there were still a lot of SAMs, which is shoulder to air missiles. So they had to try and make sure that their flight pattern was erratic enough that it would be
Yeah.
hard to target them. That was a little bit scary. We
Oh,
definitely,
shit.
we wore, flak jackets sometimes on the
Yeah.
ground. And the base itself had a sort of a nickname that the troops there gave it, which was Morta Reedaville, because there were so many mortars that were being launched at it while I was there, at least while I was on base.
Oh
And
my
maybe it
God.
happened while I
Yeah.
was traveling. I didn't experience that, but my husband and his squadron experienced it quite regularly. I guess
Yeah.
maybe I just got lucky while I was over there. For the most part, though, I did feel okay. I'm in a safe space. There's troops all around. Um, I've always, and I think maybe it has to do with the fact that I traveled so much as a kid, and also
Hmm.
the fact that my husband was Air Force. He was a pilot and traveled so much that I developed this ability to sort of just compartmentalize, because I otherwise I'd be worried 24/7 if I
Oh
thought about where
yeah.
he was going and what he was doing
Yeah.
and what he couldn't tell me and that sort of stuff. So I
Oh yeah.
developed, and I think this served me well overall in the news industry. Also, I developed an
Hmm.
ability to compartmentalize. Not that I wasn't empathetic, but
Yeah.
if much like perhaps a social worker, you're
Yeah.
entrenched in a lot of really disturbing and tragic stories. So you have to learn how to empathize with them, but also maintain some boundaries so that you're not, an emotional disaster, for lack of a better word.
Oh yeah. And I don't know if we talked about this. I was actually an ICU nurse. So
No, I didn't know that.
I know
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about because it's the same thing. You
Yeah.
have to do that because you can't be so distracted by what's going on so that you can't do your job.
Yeah. You
And it
can't take it all in.
sounds
Yeah.
like it, I feel like for some people, probably it sounds very like you don't have emotions, but that's not what it is at all. You just have to be able to focus.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to, um, yeah, you can't take it all in. You'd never be able to deal with it.
No,
Yeah.
no, for sure not. So when you were here
Mhm.
and you decided to transition into what you're doing now, what did that all look like?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned at the beginning of this show that the news industry is in a state of contraction because everybody is, scrolling on their phones rather
Yeah,
than watching TV. So there were periods of time, it got to the point where I felt like I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And, every time you move up, the target on your back gets a little bit bigger. And I had contemplated at, at various points through the duration of that 20 years about where I might decide to go in another direction. But it seemed
hmm,
like every time I legitimately thought about that, some other, bigger or better or, new position opened up in a bigger market. Um, and so I just I was content. I understood the business. I was pretty good at it at that point, and so I kept taking the next thing that was offered. When I finally got up to New York City, I was there for 4 years. I had my third child, I was doing morning TV, which I absolutely love. It is one of the most habitual day parts for viewers, meaning
Hmm.
that audience segment has shrunk much less than, for example, the 11 p.m. news or the
Yeah.
10. Um, I love that. I loved the rapport with my co-anchors and producers and the reporters. And I really love that there was a sense of camaraderie. I also love the structure of morning TV. It's a little bit more personality driven. So there's opportunity to have more fun than some of the more formatted straight laced shows. All of that I absolutely loved. What
Yeah.
I did not love was that, especially with my third child, I was getting up at 12:30 in the morning. I was getting home at about 11 or 11:30. I was napping for a couple of hours until
Hmm.
my kids got home from school or till my new baby woke up. And then it was, baby care and activities and dinner and bath time and bed. And then I would nap for a few more hours. And
Yeah.
so my schedule was like 2 hours of sleep here and maybe 2.5 hours of sleep here. And I did that Monday through Friday for 4 years. By the time my contract was up, I was a disaster. I mean, I was a shell
I
of
bet.
myself. Marriage on the rocks. It had dropped any sort of semblance of a social life.
Yeah.
And when a new contract was offered, I either had to jump at that point,
Hmm.
or I was locked into another 3 to 4 years. And then I'm 3 to 4 years older and I'm 3 to 4 years more tired and
Yeah.
everything else that goes along with it. So I jumped, and it was sort of it was a very last minute decision. I hadn't thought about what it was that I was going to do. I hadn't built a runway. I had no idea what was coming next. And that's how I transitioned out of the news industry. When I was networking, again, I thought I was going to go work for a PR agency or maybe a production company. And it's sort of the standard track for people who leave the news, or they go be a spokesperson for, a municipality or whatever. And
Hmm.
I was networking with a woman who did PR and communications for a big law firm in New York. And she's like, "You're crazy. You have this skill set that you have developed over 20 years through practical experience, through professional coaching and consulting. You need to take that and use
Hmm.
it to build a business, because people will pay you for that." And so really, truly, that's as much thought as I put into starting the busin's. And it's been very tough. I don't have a business background. I never reported
Yeah.
on business. Um, so so it's been a steep climb, a very steep
Yeah.
climb. But here we are 5 years later. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No, but it's so interesting to me too to hear about like the backstory and kind of the behind the scenes, because I think there's this aspect of it too when we look at like why you transitioned and stuff and thinking about like even when we see people that are on TV, on the news, whatever, no one ever thinks about like the fact that they have real lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think that that really like comes across anyone's mind.
No, I would agree with that 100%. And it's almost like I don't want to say celebrity, because I never felt like that, but there is sort of that sense of, this is, I can't imagine her in her natural
Yeah.
habitat. She's just in a studio and she, reads words on a prompter, and how hard can that be? It's glamorous. They get their hair
Yeah.
done and their makeup done and all these clothes and all this other stuff. But really, that's just the stuff that you see on the outside. And you're absolutely right. There's a whole um, another side that's not public facing. And
Yeah.
that's the part that I struggled with.
Yeah, and I just find it really interesting because I think that so many people forget that everyone that we see out there is a real person also. So it's
Yeah,
just very interesting.
it sounds crazy, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You're like, of course they're a real person, but we don't. I mean, the
No.
way we think of celebs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what you're doing now and helping people show up on camera and the PR side of things that you're getting into. So let's talk about that because I think too, this is so important. I think that video is becoming more of a big thing. Um, and it's just getting more important. Like people want to watch videos all the time
Yeah.
rather than read stuff, I guess. But it's just how our world is. Like you're constantly watching videos. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. LinkedIn right now is doing a huge push for
Mhm.
video. And I mean, I can see the difference in what they're serving up in the impressions on my posts. If I
Yeah.
do a picture post, it doesn't get as many, they're not pushing it out to as many people. And they've created a video feed, much like Instagram has or TikTok, for better or
Mhm.
worse. Um, and so LinkedIn is doing a big push, but there's so many other avenues for video use, for your websites, for
Yeah.
demos, for, video podcasts,
Yeah.
um, for marketing and sales assets and, you know, VSLs or video sales letters. And so there's a whole bunch of opportunity for business owners. If they're not on camera, they are missing out on a huge opportunity to reach a bigger audience. I mean, video really does function as a 24/7 sales team.
Mhm.
And you've got live streams and you've got webinars and you've got all these opportunities to keep yourself top of mind and to make a deeper connection with
Yeah.
somebody than you can with, text or copy. And so the video component is getting more and more important. And as a younger demographic begins to become consumers and business owners, that video component will only grow more important because they grew up, my daughter who's 14, she doesn't Google things, she YouTubes
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Right. So eventually,
Mhm.
one day, and that day has already arrived, that will be the way that they consume information about your business.
Yeah.
She will
Yeah.
become a
Absolutely.
consumer, yeah, or a business owner, and will need to do the same thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when you're working with someone and helping them show up on camera, what are some of, I guess, first off, I want to know what are the biggest struggles that you see with most people?
It's a good question. And there's one major struggle. And there's so many people out there who are so video averse that they
Yeah.
won't even attempt to try it, which is a huge mistake. It's completely letting fear dictate. And if you have a business, you're self-sabotaging. Um, the biggest challenge that most people have because they're averse, and this is sort of a two-part answer, is they get timid when they try it. They may be completely bubbly and full of energy when they're in person. They may be able to command a stage with a live audience, but put them
Mhm.
in front of a little green or red dot or a little circle on their phone or their webcam, and they get very small. Psychologically, it's
Yeah.
because they see the audience or the camera as a predator, really. And so when you're in front of a predator, you want to shrink, you don't want to draw attention. And so it means your voice gets a little more monotone and your facial expressions are reduced and you don't use as much body language to convey your message. And so video already without that part is energetically flattening, right? You've got
Mhm.
hardware and software that's transmitting sound and it's transmitting pictures, and it diminishes in quality every time it goes through one of those tracks. I'm not sure, that's not the right word, I can't remember what word I'm looking for, but every time it goes through one of those elements, it diminishes a little bit.
Mhm.
Then you have the fact that video is without context, meaning you can't see anything that's going around, you can't see an audience, you are sort of talking to yourself, right?
Yeah.
Which is, so people get in their head and they start to spiral. And then because video has taken you, a 3D person, and put you into a 2D box, if you will, you have that additional reduction in, energy. So the biggest mistake that people make is they are energetically flat. And I know this to be true because I experienced the same thing when I worked
Yeah.
in the news. And it was only after it was called to my attention. I mean, I thought I was delivering with energy and
Yeah.
empathy and all this other stuff until I had a viewer tell me quite deliberately over email that I was not, in fact, delivering the way that I thought I was.
Well, thank you.
In
Yeah.
tweets are a thing. Um,
Hey.
and so I recognized that I needed to bump up my energy. Doesn't mean that I'm not myself. It just means I'm a little bit of a bigger version of myself on camera than I might be when I'm talking to someone one-on-one. In much the same way, they're not exactly the same, but in a similar way as you might be when you're speaking on a stage. If you're speaking
Mhm.
on a stage to a room of 400 people and there's a million distractions and you're trying to make sure the person in the back row can hear you and you're trying to inspire them, right? You speak very differently than you would if you're sitting on the couch talking to your daughter or your son or your
Yeah.
spouse or your, right? So being on camera is very similar. I like to think of it, and then I'll wrap this answer up. I apologize for talking so
No,
long.
it's okay. It's good.
This is a hands down the biggest mistake I see. If you imagine yourself at a noisy restaurant and you are at a table of 8, let's say, and you are down on one side of the table on this side, and there is somebody on the other side of the table, and you are trying to talk to them,
Mhm.
aside from getting up and walking over to them, what are some of the things that you might do in order to make sure that they understood what you were saying? You probably lean in to indicate something is important or exciting. You might use hand gestures if you were trying to use numbers or say somebody had stopped. You would probably amplify your facial expressions. Conceptually speaking, being on camera is exactly the same thing. For most people,
Mm.
it's about a 25% bump. It will feel wildly awkward when you try it. You will feel like you look like a crazy used car salesman.
Yeah.
It feels very odd. But if you go back and watch, I promise you will look like you are delivering with less energy than you thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can see exactly what you're saying because I look back to when well, even before I started my business, it's funny because I posted a reel yesterday and it was like the first video I ever recorded and posted online, and it was 8 years ago. Oh my
And
God.
you can, is
Wildly
it
different than
awful?
now. Wildly different. It had nothing to do with business. I was
Yeah.
like, I had to post it because I wanted to enter this fitness challenge, and it was like one of the things you had to do.
Yeah.
And I felt like I was dying inside. And I
Yeah.
probably recorded it about 20 times.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
Did it get any better on take 20?
no, I'm sure that it didn't. And I just said, fuck it. This is as good as it's getting. So this is what's going up.
Putting this up. Yeah. It's kind of like my first live shot.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is it.
Yeah.
So
This is as good as it get, folks.
yeah, I can totally see that. And I mean, I hear all the time from people how hard it is to
Mhm.
show up on camera and how much they get into their head. And it is something that you really have to work through. Because I
Yeah.
know for myself too, like, this is not something I ever thought I was going to do. Like,
Yeah.
even speaking like this and thinking about putting it on YouTube or speaking on my stories, like anything like that. And it seems
Yeah.
so little, but
It's a big
it,
deal.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Yep. Mhm.
And it is really hard for a lot of people. Now, I don't care at all, but
Yeah.
it's really hard when you first start.
Yeah, and the confidence in it doesn't come until after you take the action. At
Yeah.
least that's how it worked for me, and that's how it works for most of my clients. They may have attempted video or a live stream and they realize, oh my gosh, not only do I not know what I'm doing, I am not confident in my ability to even get through from the beginning to the end. And so the action comes before you are able to get to the place where you're confident. Like, when I was working in the news industry, I remember a breaking news story. My co-anchor wasn't there and I had to carry the story by myself. We didn't have any videos. There were no cameras out there yet. The crews were on the way to the scene and I had like 3 words of information and somehow I had to muddle through 15 minutes of filling time with no information before the crews were able to get on the scene and put up the mast for the live truck and shoot back an image. Anyway, it was not pretty at all, but I remember at the end of it, after I got up from the anchor desk and I walked, back to the newsroom, like, oh shit, I got through it. I did it. And it wasn't pretty, but I managed to get from the beginning to the end. And for me, while it wasn't, necessarily a bright epiphany moment, I do recognize now in hindsight that is where the real change started happening for me, because I finally had, this is like the last hurdle, and I finally had confidence in my ability to do it. And then I got very comfortable with, pushing the envelope or pushing the boundary and seeing, what else I could do and what worked and what didn't work. And if it didn't work, I was okay with it because I was trying something new. And that's where ultimately the real change happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is exactly what happens. You can see like a little switch. And when it really clicks and people feel that much more comfortable and they're just like, okay, I can do this.
Yeah. Yep. And it helps to know what the skills are. It's easy to fly blind and try and, it's not easy, but it seems like it's going to be easier rather than getting help. You're going to try and do this thing.
Yeah.
And for most people, they don't know what they're doing wrong. They show the video to a spouse or whatever for some feedback, and the spouse knows something's off, but they can't quite pinpoint it either. And they don't know how to guide them through the change. And so it's really a much quicker process if you have somebody, whoever it is, guiding you, who knows what they're doing from point A to point B or point C or wherever it is that you want to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are the things when you work with clients, how do you get them into doing this, feeling more comfortable? What are the things that you suggest like people do and work on in order to present themselves better on camera and feel more comfortable about it?
It's you can't dabble. You got to jump in with 2 feet. If you dabble, you're never going to get good at it. The way I got good at it was I had to do it every single day. And while I don't suggest that people need to post videos every day, I do start, like all of my clients, and I offer this advice to the audience now. I like to do what I call a 30 and 30-day challenge, which is open up your phone and riff into it about anything. It doesn't need to be work related. It can be about a new recipe you tried. It can be about a new restaurant. It could be about a paperclip. It doesn't matter. And you just riff for 30 seconds. Watch that video that first day that you try it and pick one thing that you want to work on, whether it is eye contact or energy or facial expressions or reducing filler words or whatever it is. Work on that until you feel like you have your arms around it, and then pick one other thing to work on and work on that until you have your arms around it. And it may take you more than 30 days, but at the 30-day mark, go back and look at video 1 versus video 30, and you will see a difference. If you try and fix everything all at once, you'll fix none of the things, or you'll make limited progress in them. So I always suggest pick one thing and work on it. When I'm working with clients, I usually work with them for either 2 months or 3 months. I have a few, one-off services that I do and some content creation, some video content creation. But if they're taking a coaching package, it's 2 or 3 months. The way I determine what they need is we do an initial assessment where we look at baseline skills. We look at what they want to use these skills for and where they want to go. And then while there are some core competencies that are part of every training program, I then develop a curriculum based on what it is that they're trying to do and their weaknesses and their strengths. One other thing that I like to do with people is I send them on our second week for a Gallup strengths assessment. And I have a Gallup's certified coach who I partner with for this. And the really cool thing about it is because we're so focused usually on eliminating or reducing the weaknesses, we forget all about the strengths that people currently have and how when you build upon them, you can create an on-camera persona that's really authentic to
Yeah.
yourself. And so we go through this assessment and we look at their top 5 strengths and we figure out how they relate to their on-camera presence. And so we craft, again, I craft part of the curriculum about not just reducing weaknesses, but also about building on the strengths that they already have. And then they see progress with that. And it's every little step is another little boost of confidence.
Hmm. Wow, that is amazing. Like that's so much. And it just seems like it would be so helpful because it's pinpointing exactly what they need. And yeah, it just seems like that would be just so helpful for people.
Yeah. I might be a little bit biased, but I think that it is.
Yeah.
I know that my clients say that it is, and I know they've gotten, much more comfortable with not even just being on camera, but understanding their niche a little bit more
Yeah.
and just feeling it, that confidence trickles down into so many other areas or arenas of
Hmm.
your life. You get more comfortable speaking up in meetings, you get more comfortable talking to clients, you get more comfortable with sales, your messaging begins to align and
Hmm.
perhaps get a little more concise and a little more interesting. The skills are, certainly focused on the camera element, but they have application to so many other areas of business and personal life.
Yeah. Interesting. And I mean, I don't know of anyone else, and I'm sure that there are people out there that do what you do, but I don't know of anyone else or many people that do
Yeah.
what you do.
Sometimes they're called media trainers, and you'll often hear about executives or PR firms use media trainers for clients,
That
especially if they're
makes
going
sense.
into like crisis communications or something along those lines.
Hmm.
But while I have worked with executives and I've worked with journalists who are looking to be on TV, I actually really like working with business owners and coaches and
Yeah.
consultants, because when I see the light go off for them and I know, or go on, I should say, and when I know that they have a skill now that can really directly impact their business of these, smaller business owners, it gives me a sense of joy as well, more
Mhm.
so. And while it's certainly very important, but more so than working with perhaps an executive who has
Yeah.
somebody creating their messaging and somebody who is, they have a studio that they might be recording a video in. They have, a lot more resources. I really enjoy working with the smaller business owners.
Yeah. And I think that that's so important because it is so important that we're able to get our message out, that we're able to actually, do what we want to do because we started businesses to do that. So
Yeah.
it's a really important part of it. Now, while we have a few more minutes, let's talk about the PR side of things because I mentioned this to you before we started recording, and I think it's really interesting because I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of other people think this too, but when you hear PR as like a regular person, you think like PR teams for celebs that go and like do damage control and blah blah blah. That's not, and like I know this, but that's not always what PR is. So
No.
explain what you do in terms of PR for people.
Yeah. So I coach business owners how to generate their own PR without hiring a PR agency. You might also call PR publicity opportunities. So what does that mean? That means if you want to be interviewed on CNBC, which is a cable network here in the States, or
Yeah.
Fox Business, or you want an article or a guest post in Forbes or Entrepreneur or Business Insider or any other number of websites or editorial, meaning magazines.
Yeah.
And so when when people think about PR, they think about damage control, they think about crisis communications. When it applies to the small business owner, though, it's really about generating visibility, credibility, and authority
Yeah.
to new audiences at scale. And so there is a process. It's not that you have to have a big name or a huge following to get in any of those publications or in any of those outlets, but it is about understanding the media. It's about understanding your story. It's about putting together a compelling message and pitch. And then it's knowing where the heck you need to pitch it, and how do you establish relationships with those editors and those journalists and those producers. So my PR program, called Perfect Pitch Media Mastery, is a 3-month program that guides business owners from beginning to end of this process. There's a media training component. So if you are on camera, you understand how to answer. There's a messaging component. There is another module that's all about how to leverage media for additional media opportunities and exposure. So we really walk people, business owners, through this process from beginning to end.
Yeah. And that's so important. And I think that explaining it that way makes so much more sense, because people are always looking for these opportunities and to be on, like, featured on different things.
Yep.
But it is about actually knowing how to approach them, knowing even who the contact is,
Yeah. Yep.
all of these things. And I know that even for myself, I have this podcast and I get emails for people wanting to come on it. And some of them I'm just like, no, like, there's
Yeah.
no way. And you have to know how to do it properly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
especially when you're approaching bigger publications, like, you really need to know what you're doing.
Yeah, it may be easier. In fact, it is easier if you're approaching like maybe a smaller local paper who's really
Mhm.
maybe struggling even to get content and to get stories, or a smaller local TV station. When you're right, but you leverage those opportunities to get to the bigger ones. You
Yeah.
leverage those for your bigger publications and your larger network television shows, and whatever it is that aligns with your goals and who you're looking to get in front of. I always like to say there's sort of 2 buckets to visibility, or to PR publicity. One is really about visibility, and one is about credibility. And so TV is sort of the ultimate social proof. It may
Hmm.
not be your target audience, but to be able to say, as seen on, Fox Business or CNBC or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's really about the credibility. And then the visibility are this, podcasts, for example, or smaller niche media outlets that really put you in front of your ideal clients. So if you
Yeah.
are in the elder care space, you're have something in the AARP newsletter, or if you're in a childhood, I don't know, mental health expert, maybe it's Parenting Magazine or some of those other publications that are targeted. And that's really more about the visibility element.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes so much sense. And I'm sure that there are things that you would think of and know about
Yeah.
that people generally wouldn't. So I just think that that would be so helpful.
Yeah. I come at it from the experience of a business owner pitching myself, but also drawing really heavily on my broadcast experience. I was in the
Mhm.
media for 20 years. I know what makes a pitch land. I know, how you need to approach reporters and journalists and editors so that your
Mhm.
pitch gets opened. And I understand what the media is looking for, what types of people they want to work with. And so again, I draw very heavily on my background in order to help my clients do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that would be, like, so valuable to have that.
I
Yes.
again, I'm biased, but I know it's valuable for my clients
Well,
and for me.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, one last question.
Yeah.
What is the biggest impact that you want to make with your business this year?
The biggest impact I would like to make with my business this year, I would like to help more clients, especially with the PR component. I think that it remains a mystery to so many people. ideally, I would love to be able to grow my business to a point where I have, more, I'm able to impact more people. I would like to start a group program so that I can bring more people in and give them guidance, at a lower price point. So, it is all about helping people, and
Mhm.
that's what lights me up. And I'd like to do more of that in different formats this year.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because I'm all about that too. So
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining me. Where can everyone find you?
The easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn. I post daily content there about speaking on camera and also about PR. So all you have to do is look me up, Kerry, Kerry Barrett, Barrett. I've got a ton of free resources there. You can book a free strategy call. That's sort of like my own landing page. So I would check that out before you did anything else.
Amazing. And your LinkedIn is really good. So I highly recommend going and checking that out because it's amazing. And you have so many good videos on there.
Thank you. I
Not a
appreciate you.
surprise. The like video queen, you should. So thank you
Thank
so much for joining me.
It's a
And
pleasure. Thank you so much
yeah,
for having me.
yeah, it was a great conversation. And yeah, like or how do you like? No, 5-star rating, review, do all of the things,
Do the things.
do the things. And I will catch you in the next one.